Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 29th of September, 2025. Let's get started. Hey, folks, it is absolutely awesome to be back with you. I know it's been a while since we put out content. I apologize. Some other life stuff got in the way. Lots of fun family time and vacations with the kiddos, which was awesome. And also recently did a spat of interviews and appearances on Pakistani media, of all places. I know. The audience is booming, and it's booming overseas. Who would have thunk it? The internet is a strange place. But that's been fun. Coming back to the podcast, though, happy to be here. Have some new studio tips and tricks to try out. And also happy to share that the podcast has recently joined up with the Work Defined Podcast Network, which is a collection of podcasters who discuss professional topics related to a variety of industries. Super happy to be part of the team here. And you will see some changes in the podcast. Most notably, each episode will carry a commercial for another podcast on the network. It's how we cross-pollinate and promote everybody's work. Happy to be a part of it. Thrilled to get more exposure for this podcast with other professional communities out there. It's going to be awesome. Now, that said, the topic of the day. A few weeks ago, a while back now, there was a big party off in China, and there was a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And unlike most years where they meet, the media actually paid attention. A lot of really cool and interesting things happened. China put on a kick-ass military parade, lots of drone swarms, lots of great marching and drilling. Their toy soldiers were all wound up and doing wonderful things. Very impressive display of military prowess. Of course, putting it in a parade and putting it in a fight are two very different things. Kind of curious when you compare that to our own military parade that happened in Washington, D.C. Let's just say it wasn't quite as impressive. And when you compare world leaders, Donald Trump, there's a lot of things you can say about him. He is a marketing and branding genius, though. I mean, he's a savant when it comes to that. He really knows how to feel the vibes and put a message out there. He's got his own unique approach to it, but he's effective. And when you compare the parade that we had in Washington, D.C. with what China had in coordination with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, you'll wonder, why'd we bother trying? Anyone could have predicted it wasn't going to stack up well visually. That's just a fact. Maybe because we spent the last 20 years fighting the global war on terror and not doing drill and ceremony. I don't know. That's just an idea. But anyway, really interesting conference. All sorts of people showed up. And not only did all sorts of people showed up, but we saw a lot of buddy-buddy talk with Putin and Xi, and Modi from India and Xi. Turkey was there, a NATO ally. They go every year, but still curious to see a NATO ally showing up at a major foreign conference with our major geopolitical rival. And a bunch of other countries in the region were there. Now, much has been made of the chummy talk and the chummy pictures coming out of the event, especially between Modi, Xi, and Putin. And whether or not this is just a flash in the pan, is this good marketing, or does this actually represent a real realignment of interest in the region? Was this just a big public middle finger to the rules-based international order led by America? Was this just an FU to Donald Trump because Modi and Trump are having a bit of a spat? And so Modi wanted to cozy up to Xi, who he also has his own problems with, and Putin was there. Does this mean anything, or was it just a photo op? Hard to see the signal through the noise. But today we're going to talk to somebody who can help us do just that. Awesome guest today. Super happy to have her on. Her name is Henrietta Levin, and she is a senior fellow with the Friedman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., which is where all the nerdiest of the nerds go to hang out. One of the top spots for nerds. She previously held senior roles in the State Department and the White House, spearheading U.S. strategy and diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, with particular focus on China and its global impact, Southeast Asia, and the region's multilateral architecture, which is really what we want to get into. It's easy to deep dive countries. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's a good starting point to deep dive countries, but we really want to understand how is the multilateral architecture between states in the region evolving, and what does this conference actually show us about the current state of affairs? So super happy to have her on. Had a really fun talk. And with that, let's get to our conversation with Henrietta Levin. Well, good morning and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing this today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. Excited to talk about this. Could you introduce yourself in your own words to the audience, where you're from, what do you do, why you apparently know a lot about China and all things going on in the Indo-Pacific?
Maybe on a good day. Of course, again, my name is Henrietta. I'm currently a senior fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I joined CSIS somewhat recently after spending many years with the U.S. federal government, at the Pentagon, State Department, and the White House National Security Council, doing my best to manage the U.S.-China relationship, as well as engagement with U.S. allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific. I originally was supposed to be a Europe person, actually. Like in grad school, I had a vision of a very Brussels-centered life. The idea of European integration seemed to me, and probably literally no one else, very exciting. But I was very lucky that the U.S. government had different ideas for me. So when I joined the Office of the Secretary of Defense initially as a presidential management fellow, I was pivoted to Asia. And I felt very lucky. Can take no credit for the choice, but such an incredible part of the world. I've loved the work so much. Though in my last role at the State Department, I was managing China global policy. And so admittedly, I did have a little bit of fun in that role, going back to Europe quite often to, talk to our European friends about how we deal with China together and kind of undertake a response as a common challenge. So got to pull those threads back together.
Cool. And how are our European friends feeling about China and the U.S.?
Confused, like so many of us at this time.
That's a very polite way of putting it. Confused. That's nice.
You can still see, like, the State Department speak isn't totally out of my bloodstream yet. But I think that the Europeans have, like, if we're thinking about, what are Europeans? But I think let's start with Brussels. I think the EU itself, the Commission, von der Leyen, have been quite capable at maintaining a strong principled stance in their own relationship with China and pursuing with consistency and conviction many of the really important policy priorities when it comes to China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, when it comes to industrial overcapacity and China's economic practices that distort international markets. Brussels has taken a very clear line on that at a time when the U.S. position varies. So, in the past, that's
real
always
quick. Let me check Trump's Twitter feed, see if anything changed.
I know. I'm always nervous if I'm like 5 seconds out of date of what my phone tells me U.S. policy is these days. But in the past, engaging Beijing on any of those questions or pressuring Beijing on any of those questions would have been a common effort. Washington, the Europeans, we've talked together, we develop a common understanding, at the very least, coordinate our sense of next steps, if not pursue concrete joint action, which was sometimes the case. And I think there's a little less of that now. But good to see the Europeans keeping up their end of the
you
bargain.
Definitely spent time in the State Department. Okay. Well, so speaking of, China and their relationships to other countries, there was recently this lovely summit. I missed my ticket, must have gotten lost in the mail, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that happened about almost 3 weeks ago now, going on in China. Turned up a lot of news this year, which is atypical for it to get as much coverage as it did, but that was exciting to watch. But could you explain to people what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is, and then we can get into this year's summit?
Sure, and I would expect that this was the year that many learned that the SCO exists. I think it is unusual to get this degree of coverage in, mainstream international
Honestly, I'd
press.
forgotten about it.
It's there.
Then I saw it, like, oh yeah, that's still a thing. And I started reading into it. I was like, oh,
Still a thing. Even more of
okay.
a thing.
So, well, what is it?
The SEO originated in the 90s in the aftermath of the disintegration of the Soviet Union as an agreement of China, Russia, and three Central Asian states to manage border disputes and border security questions. Since then, the organization has evolved significantly in terms of membership, bringing in more of Central Asia, as well as India, Pakistan, Belarus. And so it's not just the question of how India and China manage kind of questions of Central Asia, but now there's this South Asia dynamic as well. Though I think the Central Asian focus of the institution still is quite pronounced, even now. And then the SEO has also expanded to develop this big network of observers and partners and different kind of modes of semi-affiliation. And so you have the actual members and then, an electron cloud of other countries that engage to some degree with the SEO as an institution and its kind of summit and meeting calendar. Which they decided to simplify into kind of this year into a single tier of, I think, dialogue partners for those that engage with SEO but aren't members. So the scope of the organization, what it covers, what it's responsible for, has increased over time as well. This is about much more than border disputes. The SEO still, I think, is kind of primarily a security-focused organization. But if you look at the charter, it considers itself responsible for every kind of regional cooperation, including on the economic, political, sociocultural side of the ledger. But you also see in the charter a mandate the SEO gives itself to build a new world order. And so, in that way, the SEO, I think, is increasingly significant. And we saw that really coming out of the summit in Tianjin a few weeks ago, that SEO is a really important platform for China as it seeks to accelerate its longstanding efforts to build an alternative world order that looks a little more like Beijing in terms of values and norms and practices than the rules-based international order that we've all come to know and love. So I think there's a common critique of SEO is like, but what does it do?
Yeah.
Similar to BRICS, et cetera. Like, what does it do? But coming out of Tianjin, there were a few concrete announcements, like the establishment of a development bank that SEO will, launch for the region. But I think really the summit stood out to me as significant from a global governance perspective on this question of what is China trying to make the world look like and what are the institutions it's drawing on to achieve those goals.
So a lot of the press that's come out about this recent one, of course, mentioned a lot to do with reaction to things that Trump has said in the current administration and some changing themes and messaging that they got going on there. But this organization, you said, started back in the 1990s. So this is part of a long-term plan that's not really a response to any particular U.S. administration or regime. Is that correct?
Well, I think that displacing U.S. leadership in the region and increasingly the world is a long-standing preference, if not objective, of the SEO. At the same time, though, this is not a reaction to the current U.S. administration. I mean, this is a much longer project that China and Russia have led. I think it's also worth noting that when the SEO kind of came into being, maybe taking a few years out from the collapse of the Soviet Union, you would have seen Russia and China as something probably closer to equal partners. whereas
Hmm.
now that is deeply not the case. I mean, China um, runs SEO. I mean, their influence is unquestioned. And in the China Russia relationship, Russia's increasingly the junior partner due to its very significant economic, financial, military dependence on Beijing. So, in some ways, the organization, the power balances within the organization have evolved quite significantly over time.
Okay. And how that's internal to the organization, but how has the organization's influence increased since it was founded regionally?
It's a good question. I mean, you see China measuring that by their claims that they have the most highest level participation from the most countries coming to Tianjin in comparison to prior summits. And the SEO has an annual, summit. So this is the attractive power of the convening is something that we can track over time. And we should think about this also in the context in which China's vision of world order uh, is a world that increasingly orbits Beijing. So it's not just an order that's more friendly to authoritarian values, more accommodating of China's parochial interests when it comes to things like Taiwan or China's unlawful claims in the South China Sea. But it's also about like China's centrality in all of this. Almost, and not to get too far into the weeds, but I'm going to do it. There was a Central Work Conference on
It's a podcast.
periphery.
It's a podcast of nerds for nerds. Go in the weeds. Go in the weeds.
Okay, I'm going to do it. There was a Central Work Conference that President Xi addressed in Beijing on periphery affairs back in the spring of this year. And so I bring this up because I think, there's no country in the world that has a national self-concept as the periphery of another country. Like that's not how anyone in the world sees themselves, but it's how China sees its neighbors. It's how China sees the geography of the SEO membership. It's the periphery. Um, though they now translate the word into English as neighboring countries. They just started doing it this year, but the Chinese hasn't changed. So, periphery.
Glad to see
Um,
their marketing is getting a little better.
like a little bit, but
Uh
not that much, but a little
Yep.
bit.
Branding matters. Branding matters. Okay.
Branding matters. But I mention that in part because I think it helps us think about why China would see SEO as valuable as an organization that convenes much of that geographic periphery. Um, and provides China with an opportunity to lead and reshape the architecture of international order kind of around it in that part of the world. Um, so of course, also one of the most interesting announcements coming out of the SEO, I thought, was a new global governance initiative. And so this is the fourth of China's big global initiatives. They've been announcing them, I think, since 2021. So you have a global development initiative, global security initiative. I think until now, most ominously, the Global Cultural Initiative, and now a
Mm.
global governance. So these initiatives are often described in pretty abstract ideological language, but they're intended to be the normative framework in which China pursues its global foreign policy and in which it advances again its vision of world order. And so I think it is significant that China chose SEO specifically to announce the Global Governance Initiative. Because, for example, if we go back to 2021, the Development Initiative, that was actually announced with the UN, which in a way, it's a much more inclusive platform. It's more, I think to an American or European ear, it's less threatening
Mhm.
to kind of to our own interests. As much as if you parse the language, there's a lot of problematic stuff in there. If you just say, well, who could say development's bad and the UN should do development? It's
Mhm.
easier to kind of wrap your mind around it. If you're not gonna
So,
kind of
so
read
you're
the
saying
details.
that what global leaders say in major forums should actually be parsed carefully and understood for nuance?
That is a
As
controversial argument
as an
I
American, I struggle
am
with
putting
that.
forward.
Okay.
I know. It's a little out there, but
Uh-huh.
I have to speak truth to power on listening to things that people say. Um,
Wonderful. Okay, so when global leaders say things, they actually mean them. I'll write that down
well, I'm
somewhere.
not saying they mean them, but they mean something. And
Ah,
it's
that's
worth
fair
figuring out what
point.
that is.
Fair point. That's an important clarification. Okay. Now, was that development initiative? Was that like the precursor to Belt and Road?
No, it's actually the other way. So Belt
Okay.
and Road had been out there in the world for almost a decade at that point. And
Oh,
then
you said
GDI
2021.
layered,
Okay.
yeah, and then GDI
Sorry.
layered on top. So I think, I mean, this isn't exactly how like China frames the relationship, but I think about BRI in a way as like kind of the implementation of the normative framework that GDI establishes. Even though BRI came first, so they're kind of like retrofitting
Hmm.
the strategic vision onto what already now exists in the world. But I would think of the relationship that way. Um, so now there is a global governance initiative, which, and so announcing that at SEO really stood out to me because it seems, I mean, the venue for these announcements, like that is never by accident. Like that's a very careful choice on China's part. So it's signaling that China does see the SEO itself as an extremely integral, if not central, institution through
Hmm.
which it intends to rewrite the global order.
So, what about this year caused so much headlines? What about this year actually got this covered pretty widely in Western press?
Um, the visuals were very striking. I think we all saw these pictures and videos of President Xi, Putin, and then Prime Minister Modi
Hmm.
having these very warm engagements. And I think that definitely caught some international attention. The India China story is an important part of this meeting, though I think um, a little more complicated than the photos would tell you on their own. And so just to take a step back on that piece, China and India have all kinds of structural tensions in the relationship, whether you're talking about China's very strong support for Pakistan, India's rival, or Tibet and India's hosting of the Dalai Lama, all kinds of things. But most recently, the pronounced issue has been the border. And in 2020, there were clashes along their border in Himalayas. And as a result, the relationship between China and India effectively was shut down. And the Indian side refused to engage in any kind of normal economic or diplomatic processes with China until there was a acceptable resolution of the border issue. Okay, so we're going into um, at least last year with almost like no engagement between India and China. And of course, at the same time, think about the context. You have the Quad doing a lot more. You have the U.S. and India partnership really accelerating to an unprecedented level after years and years and years of bipartisan work on that. And so, okay, then towards the end of last year, and this is actually before the U.S. election, India and China start to move towards rapprochement. Very carefully, slowly, incrementally. They make a little bit of progress on the border. So the relationship starts going in a more positive direction. Um, then, of course, at SEO, we saw this extremely warm, friendly meeting with Modi and Xi acting like old friends. And I think even for those of us who have been following that like more incremental series of improvements in the China-India partnership, there was just like a lot of smiles and maybe like slightly bigger smiles than I would have necessarily expected. The tone of these meetings is really important. So and then, of course, the U.S. context. Before we were talking about a wonderful accelerating partnership. In the past few weeks, the U.S. has unfortunately immolated the U.S.-India partnership. So that relationship is in a horrible place. And
Who would
then
have
Modi
thought that
goes,
50% tariffs would not have made him happy? I don't.
"Who
Who
would
would
have
have
thought?"
thought that?
So then, you have Modi in Tianjin,
Mhm.
basically signaling that he has other friends. And I think that the meeting was significant. I think this does indicate a true acceleration of that
Mhm.
rapprochement that was already underway. But there's still going to be a really low ceiling on how far the China-India piece is going to go because there's zero trust on either side, and
Yeah.
even in how both sides described their conversation at the SCO, you see like a lot of latent tension. So a phrase that got a lot of press coverage here in Washington is that they both said, okay, India and China should be partners, not rivals. So clearly that was coordinated language, but apparently it was only like 50% coordinated because if you look at the actual readouts, China says, across the board, the relationship should be partner, not rival. India says we should be development partners, not rivals. So carving out the economic space in the relationship. And that's a much more narrow and wary
Hmm.
construction
That
than
really
the one that
limits
China
the focus of the
presented. Yes.
cooperation.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how much of the current attention given to SEO this year, how much is it because it was a unique photo opportunity, lots of shiny objects out there in that military parade, global cast of characters from powerful countries that we'd like to be friends with? How much of this is just bad imaging for our part, and how much of it represents actual substantive change in how regional interests are aligned?
Yeah. Um, I think that I think that the level of confidence that we see from China in pursuing what may be, longstanding objectives is notable. So for China to say the quiet part out loud to announce a global governance initiative, like it's not new at all that China's trying to displace US leadership, trying to build a new world order in its own image. Like that's been going on for a long time. But I think in the past, China would have been more careful to pretend otherwise. For fear of developing antibodies and G7 and elsewhere. Um, they don't seem to be worried about that anymore. Like just when I say confidence, I think it's a different kind of confidence than what we saw, a few years ago during COVID, where there's all this like wolf warrior diplomacy that I'm sure we all remember well, like very aggressive,
Mm-hmm.
like Twitter use from Chinese diplomats, like condemning the rest of the world. That
Yep.
to me looks like trying to look confident. What I see at the SEO seems to be more of a manifestation or an illustration of confidence. And that worries me because it suggests that Beijing may misunderstand the level of risk that they will be taking on in more frontally challenging some of these longstanding norms that have underwritten the rules-based international order for decades.
Gotcha. So if they're feeling this froggy about, or sorry, this confident about their role in the world, they might miscalculate the impact of an action that might trigger an escalation, doing something like being more aggressive towards Taiwan or taking on certain trade actions.
Exactly. Um,
Okay.
I think also these meetings are are important, um, even just as a convening function.
Hmm.
So again, get to the question of like, but what does SEO do? I mean, even just creating space for this particular set of leaders, for Putin and Modi and Xi and others, many Southeast Asian leaders attended as well, just to spend time together I mean, that is significant,
Yeah.
especially in these authoritarian systems where it's probably rather uncommon for leaders to receive kind of unfiltered outside information. Other heads of state can sometimes be
Yes.
the best source of that. So I think that that's a quite significant piece as well. And so, for example, I just mentioned like a lot of Southeast Asian countries attended. President Prabowo from Indonesia almost pulled out because of domestic issues, but at the last minute he decided so important, have to go. And like that
Yeah.
alone is like a pretty significant signal
Hmm.
of China's ability to marshal regional support for this vision of world order, for a vision of Chinese leadership. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you would have seen them achieve quite so much success uh, on that front in prior years.
So, how much is this support that they're garnering regionally? Because the attendance list keeps growing, and you just gave us a great example. It's easy to look at someone like Russia, and they have a vested interest in creating breathing room for themselves, counter to the U.S. international order. Always been that way. Modi's got his own beef going on with Trump right now for a variety of reasons. Very understandable why he's showing up in China to wave the flag and talk about how he's got all these new best friends. But for the smaller players in the region, how much is their attention, their participation, their maybe we'd call it support? I don't know. How much of their participation in SEO is driven by a genuine desire to be aligned with China, and how much is it driven by a desire to not be trapped in a global system run by the US?
Yeah. Um, I think it's a little bit of everything. If you asked any country in China's neighborhood and asked, do you want China to run Asia? I'm pretty sure you would get like a strong uniform no. Like I don't think anyone's like, that's such a great thing for me and my country to have to follow Chinese orders. But I think there is a genuine attractiveness to China's development model. I think China has been successful. You know, there's kind of like a habit in Washington of like China can't do soft power, but like China China has done the soft power
Mhm.
in a way that's quite different from how the US has traditionally thought about those tools. But I think China has been effective in the region and in the global south more broadly in portraying its model of development as a model of the future and portraying its assistance, as problematic as BRI projects can sometimes be, as forward looking, as the bridge towards a science forward society that
Mhm.
looks like Shanghai. And does that actually pan out? Like most of the time, really not at all. But that's like an idea of of
So, how does
China
their
that
development model differ from what America or Europe would do? And let's gloss over the fact that we got rid of USAID, so this might be a mute point now. But historically, what's
yeah,
the difference between how China approaches this versus how we've done it and our allies have done it?
yeah. So if we go back to January, because right now the US doesn't really do development very much. So, but we go back to January, think about
Yeah.
what the model was. The US is very good at investing in institutions, in human capital, in capacity building, in anti-corruption, supporting civil society, supporting youth dynamism, supporting entrepreneurs, supporting small business. So US development assistance tends to be less physically visible, though we do put the from the American people stamp on everything. Um, and there's a lot of like food assistance, and there is tangible stuff, but the tangible stuff doesn't tend to be like a high-speed rail line or a very large bridge, which is the kind of construction that has characterized much of Beijing's assistance in the Belt and Road Initiative over time. I think the U.S. European development assistance, also kind of the providers of development assistance, work very hard to ensure that before they launch a project, the project's gonna make sense. It's gonna do what it's supposed to do. Like if we are supporting um, the development of, let's say, like a hospital, for example, like it would matter to USAID that that hospital would be like able to operate successfully and like provide medical care to more people than would currently be receiving medical care. And so, whereas China, I think their system is more like, what do you want? Great. like
Yeah.
they don't contest a government's choices. And so if you're a government, sometimes that's appealing. But if you're the people in the country, the model doesn't always work as well because sometimes projects are not really designed to be effective. They're just designed to be built. I don't want to. I think there is still, though, in Washington, a kind of over caricaturing of Chinese development as like bad.
Hmm.
There are very serious environmental and social implications of China's model that have caused protests around the world around some of these projects. But they have been able to deliver important and functional infrastructure to countries who had no other option for advancing to that next stage in their development path. So there is something real there as well.
Okay. One of the other interesting things that came out of this SEO was greater conversation about an alternative banking system. They talked about starting a development bank and issuing bonds and all this fun stuff. How would that work inside the SCO? And it seems like to some extent they already have an alternative banking system because two large member countries, India and China, have been purchasing Russian oil and then reselling it on the global market, working around U.S. sanctions. Is this really a development of alternative, the potential development of an alternative financial system for SCO countries, or is this more rhetoric around a reality that basically already exists?
I mean, I think it's rhetoric around a reality that does not exist.
Okay.
De-dollarization is hard, man. The dollar is very good at
I know a
certain.
lot of Indian. Well, I've read about a lot of Indian oil merchants that would beg to differ, but go on.
That's fair. I think within within trade. So if we're thinking about yuan denominated transactions, there has been a very significant increase. But if you're, but at the same time, it's very difficult to imagine Beijing letting go of the kind of financial repression that prevents the yuan from becoming anything close to a global reserve currency. But maybe putting aside that, like the actual mechanics of de-dollarization or not, or whatever. Okay, so like, what's the SEO's role in all of this? I do think it's normative. Similarly to BRICS, like, are the actual decisions and institutions of BRICS or SEO like meaningfully affecting de-dollarization? Like, no. That's more like, a question of Beijing's own financial policy and kind of alternative institutions, like alternatives to SWIFT, for example, that they're trying to build. Um, but the normalization is important, like creating a sense that de-dollarization is the future, that this is the direction of Asia. Um, that I think does create a certain momentum. It provides, I think, a layer of confidence to individuals actually, like actual commercial entities, that if Chinese entities, if the Chinese government have a very strong preference for denominating trade in yuan, then maybe they feel okay about that, just like incrementally more okay, as a result of these broader norms and expectations and this vision of the future that the SCO and BRICS have been able to develop. So I think there's often criticism of these institutions. I kind of come back to this a few times, but there's but what are they going to do anything on de-dollarization? It's like, well, they are putting in all of our heads the idea of a de-dollarized world and making that feel like an increasingly credible path for the region. And that is significant. I would also say, while we're doing financial institutions, so the announcement of the SCO Bank, one of the top outcomes from Tianjin, from the summit, really interesting. Putting aside the economics, you can see I'm like more of a geopolitical person. But so Russia's blocked this for years. Like China's been trying to get SCO to have a bank attached to it for years and years and years. And Russia has always preferred for development finance for Central Asia to be channeled through institutions that Russia controls. And it's increasingly clear that SCO is an organization where China holds most of the cards. And, a traditional point of tension in the China-Russia relationship is Central Asia question mark, because Russia, sees these former Soviet Union states as a part of their sphere of influence. Not my term, but how Russia would certainly see it. And at a time when Beijing's economic and now political influence in Central Asia is increasing rapidly, and that's something that's traditionally made Russia very uncomfortable. But at the same time, Russia is only able to continue fighting the war in Ukraine because of the systematic support they're getting from China. And so Putin's dependence on Xi grows every single day that the war continues. And so you see over time Russia making kind of a series of concessions to China that they've resisted in the past because for whatever reason they decide, well, today we are just too junior of a partner in this relationship to continue pushing back.
Let me ask you this. Do you think it would be better for America if Russia, one of our main historical rivals, was much weaker than it currently is, but as a result, we now have China in a dominant position in the region? Or is it better to have Russia be more powerful, but keep two main players in Central Asia balancing against each other? What would be preferential for the United States? A weaker Russia that leaves China in charge, or a stronger Russia that keeps both of them arguing with each other behind the scenes?
It's a very interesting question. So I would structure this through the lens of the war in Ukraine, because I think that successfully supporting Ukraine in achieving a just peace is one of the most important things the US can do, to salvage the credibility of the rules-based international order that's so integral to American security and prosperity, and to security in Asia. Because, of course, like if we're thinking about deterring China from using force to pursue reunification with Taiwan, I mean, what happens in Ukraine is important. I mean, it's all connected. So I would go with weak Russia, at least in the near to medium term, as much as it pains me to, wish for anything that would increase the relative power of Beijing. But because I think like we have to get them out of Ukraine. And like that is going to, in the long run, strengthen the US position vis-a-vis China. Even if in the near term it means that Putin gives more and more and more political and economic concessions to Xi.
Okay. Now I want to talk about Ukraine, but we don't have time to cover both. Let's come back on and talk
and
about that.
And then we'll do Africa. We'll just keep going.
We'll do a series. We'll just keep covering the world. Okay, I can't go down that rabbit hole. There's not enough time on the clock. Okay, that's all right. So speaking about multilateral institutions, NATO, most successful military alliance in history by almost every measure. Really interesting. It popped out to me that Turkey was actually at the SCO, and Turkey is definitely a very they have a unique relationship with the United States vis-a-vis other NATO members. They're probably the most non-European aligned member of the alliance, even though they've had their own internal politics swinging back and forth on that. Is there anything that we should read into Turkey's participation in SCO? Because it almost seems like they're far enough away from China, it's almost odd that they would show up.
Yeah, Turkey has been an SEO dialogue partner since I think 2012, around there. So they're not a member, but they are a partner, and they do show up to many of these meetings. I don't often see Turkey driving the agenda in the SEO context, but I think that their government um, does often pursue opportunities for diplomatic and economic engagement with, countries that make the rest of NATO rather uncomfortable. Um, but the Turkey-China relationship is quite complicated. Right now, they're trying to pretend it's not complicated and just kind of move ahead in spirit of partnership. But
Mm-hmm.
there is a very large, I mean, Chinese refugee population in Turkey, like a Uyghur population. And I'm sure listeners know, Uyghur Muslims in Western China face extreme forms of repression
Mm-hmm.
as a result of being Uyghurs, which Beijing
So
doesn't like.
it's an
Um,
ongoing genocide that no one ever talks about, even though the State
I
Department
talk
has
about
officially.
it. I
I
actually, all these, I did
Yeah,
a,
sorry. Outside of policy nerds, nobody talks about it.
okay,
Like the
okay,
State
fine.
Department declared it a genocide, and nobody even covered it. Like the BBC had an article that was like
Yeah.
over a decade ago. No one cares.
Well,
Anyway,
I care enough for all of us. So,
uh,
um, but um,
uh,
but no,
what have you
I
done
mean,
for the Uyghurs? No.
it is it is very important to generate additional international awareness about this, and it's hard because
Yes, to everyone out
China
there,
has.
there's Xi China.
Um, anyway, so Xinjiang.
Xinjiang, thank you.
And Turkey has actually in the past taken quite a principled stance regarding the situation in Xinjiang, the human rights of Uyghurs, in a way that's rather uncharacteristic for OIC countries, for kind of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which often just kind of
Uh-huh.
accepts at face value China's propaganda on this issue. So there is a little bit of complexity there, but I think the focus for Turkey right now is to try and double down on partnership with Beijing and reap as many economic dividends as they can manage from that relationship.
Awesome. Okay, so Trump was talking in the White House, and he said that clearly he was watching the summit, and they did a bunch of stuff specifically for his eyes. Have we seen any changes, or should we expect any changes in U.S. policy towards China specifically or its broader partnerships in the region as a result of this latest summit? How is the Trump administration likely to react to this?
Um, it's an it's a hard question to answer because I think the Trump administration has so many China strategies, uh, all of which seem to conflict with each other and be implemented simultaneously. So
I was about to say, like, I
you
haven't seen a strategy, but okay.
no, you see a lot of people doing a lot of things, and over the past few months, it does seem like President Trump has been uh, asking the administration to play nice with China because he so strongly wants a nice meeting with Xi Jinping. That seems to be a top priority for President Trump, at the expense of certain kind of longer standing US interests, like support for Taiwan or controlling China's access to high end US technology. Uh, but it is very clear that the direction of US China policy depends on Trump's mood in a given moment and also his perception of his personal relationship with Xi Jinping. And so, actually, as we're recording right now, I think that Trump and Xi are actually speaking on the phone.
Oh.
At least they were scheduled to around now. And so I'm going to be looking really closely at how both sides describe publicly what was actually discussed on that call, which admittedly I would do anyway.
Mhm.
But especially now when the entire direction of U.S.-China strategy seems to hinge on Trump's perception of this one personal relationship with his counterpart, the outcomes of these diplomatic engagements can be much more strategically significant, but also lack staying power because if they speak again, you could just as easily see Trump go in a different direction again.
So if you're the American business community, whether it's the, CEO of Apple or a local mom and pop craft shop that orders in supplies, you're looking at stuff going on in the region. You see the headlines from a summit like this. What should you be looking for as a signal of what's about to happen in the region that could impact your businesses here in America? What are key indicators that the business community should be aware of?
Mm. Well, of course, the tariff rates are a huge question for not just business owners, but American families, especially as we get closer and closer into the holiday season. And so right now, um, there is still this looming possibility of extremely high tariff rates. I think on the US side, it's 145% that's been paused. And for several months now, and every time Secretary Bessent from the Treasury Secretary meets with his Chinese counterpart, they seem to extend the pause. Yet again, I think right now those tariffs are due to come back into effect in November. So a huge question is is there going to be a permanent solution to the that looming trade embargo between the US and China? And I think we will have a better sense of that in the coming days as a result of this call, and as the two leaders also start to plan with greater urgency, probably an in person meeting between the two of them in Asia this fall. And so I would look very closely at indications of like the direction of travel on those questions, in part because now tied very closely to the tariffs. And again, if we're talking about 145%, like that's a trade embargo. um, Another factor is U.S. access to rare earth uh, magnets and rare earth materials. And I think this is one of those things that I would guess many of your listeners like wouldn't have thought about at all before this year, but now like everyone thinks about all the time because in retaliation for the earlier U.S. tariffs in April, China cut off U.S. access to rare earths, and that I think helped us come to terms with how the US, so much of the US manufacturing economy relies on a steady stream of these materials that China currently has a choke point on.
Yeah.
And so, how all of that plays out will be, I think, very tangibly felt. Not by like dorks like us. And sorry for including you in that, but I feel like
Proud member of the
I feel like
tribe.
we're there. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, we're there.
But this is going to be like a mom and pop issue, playing
Yeah.
out alongside the geopolitical questions we've been discussing on Taiwan and China-Russia relationship and China's support for the war in Ukraine and South China Sea and all of this, which I think can sometimes feel a little more abstract to people's
Mhm.
daily lives, but really the distinction between national security and economic security has collapsed. And so those connections, I think, are a little more clear than they might have been in the past.
Well said about the connection between national security and economic security. Quickly, as we start coming to the end of our time, if you got to sit down with Trump and tell him what to do about China, what would you say the goal of a successful China strategy would be? What's the outcome the U.S. should be looking for?
The US. So I'm going to say a tactical objective and a strategic objective. So just to have good negotiations with China, which you can do. You can do. It's hard and painful, but you can do it. Um, the US needs to approach that conversation from a position of strength and confidence and uh, coordination with allies and partners. This is how we can create an environment in which Beijing feels they have to actually negotiate with us in good faith rather than just use leverage and try and extract US concessions. And so I worry that from a tactical perspective, the current negotiating approach is a little bit backwards of what I just described. And so I think that regardless of what your policy objectives are, that will just make the whole thing a little harder. For example, the US not approving the transit of Taiwan's president through the US, which is a normal thing that's happened many times during many Republican and Democratic presidencies. I think the assumption, is that was a result of the administration wanting a really good meeting with Xi, not wanting any irritants to them. So I would have thought of that in exactly the opposite way of like the US needs to show that it's not about to compromise on its national security interests or longstanding status quo practices to get that meeting. Because once you start making those concessions, then China knows they can keep pushing for more. In terms of the overall strategic picture, I think that it is important for the leaders of the US and China to talk. If only to address misunderstandings, miscommunication, reduce the risk of conflict. Like that is incredibly important. I'm quite skeptical, though, of cutting some big deal. I think that when the US and China meet, you should have very modest deliverables, if any, to be honest. Like, for example, some of our, from the Biden administration, some of our China deliverables were restoring communication between our two militaries. Like, that is modest, but important, but modest. It's not, it's not a deal. It's a small step both sides agreed to do to mitigate the risk of unintended conflict. Because the US and Chinese interest, they don't overlap very much. Like the middle space of the Venn diagram where you can get cooperation without strategic concession, like it's just genuinely very small. And President Xi, staking his whole political legacy and authority on a vision of Chinese national greatness, he's not going to go around about offering real concessions from his side. So if you want a deal, that means the concessions have to come from the US, and I don't want to see that. So I tend to stay away from those big, beautiful deals in my ideal China strategy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Real quick, you mentioned you had your own podcast before we started recording. Where can people find more of your work?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to plug Pekingology, a CSIS podcast that unpacks the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party and what it means for the world. So you can get that Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the CSIS website, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please download and subscribe. And then you can see the rest of my work up on the CSIS page as well.
All right. We'll drop links to those in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.